Today we're going to be looking at preparing for and taking part in Home Office interviews. These slides have been specifically prepared for Baobab Women's Project, and if you can go through them with someone else, particularly if you need someone to interpret, then take time. Take time to do that, and do this in advance, particularly of your main asylum interview. Let's just talk about what we're going to be going through today. There are two types of interview which you will have if the Home Office agrees to consider your asylum application in the UK. Just sometimes they say that another country is responsible. But for most of you, you go through this process of firstly a screening interview, and I'll explain a little bit about that. We go into more detail in later slides. And secondly, a main asylum interview. So what is a screening interview? It's part of what we call the asylum registration process. It's part of when you first meet with somebody from the Home Office, either because you've gone to a Home Office building such as Croydon, or you've just arrived in the country and you've been located, or they've found you somewhere else and they start to register your details. This screening interview is headed Initial Contact and Asylum Registration Questionnaire, but we call it a screening interview. And then after that, at some point, not necessarily at any fixed date after the screening interview, there'll be a main asylum interview. By main, we mean it's a bigger interview, an interview where they call you back in order to specifically ask you more questions about what has already happened in your country, or what might you fear might happen if you return. It's called Statement of Evidence Form. SEF is what that is broken down into, asylum interview. Now, any interview should be conducted in a language that you're fluent in. Even if you've got very good English, if you feel that you can't properly understand questions or can't express yourself properly in English, then there should always be an interpreter available, preferably, if possible, in the very specific language that you are absolutely fluent in. So the Home Office should use an interpreter. If they use an interpreter, sorry, that you do not fully understand, then you may have struggle with it. But if you're able to carry on, you should ask the officer to make a note that you're not completely understanding what's being said, or you don't think the interpreter is fully understanding what you are saying to them. Because if you understand English, you're going to hear the question a little bit, you're going to hear the answer that's given. And you may need, if you've got the confidence, to say, excuse me, I think there's a bit of a problem. Or at least at the end of the interview saying, I'm not sure everything was properly understood. Now, both these interviews, the screening interview and the main asylum interview, are important. And you should make sure that you have a copy of both of the typed notes of those interviews. And either read them through yourself as soon as you can afterwards, within a few days of the interview being completed, or when you get them, or ask someone to read them to you if you can't read them yourselves because they're only available in English. And that is so that you can add information to them or sometimes correct anything that's wrong. We'll come back to that when it comes to the main asylum interview, because they will take into account what you've said, for example, in your screening interview. And if something is wrong in that and you don't correct it, they'll compare the main asylum interview with your screening interview and say you've said different things at different times. So even if you do have a legal representative, make sure, firstly, they give you a copy of any interview record they receive from the Home Office, and that they take time to go through that interview record with you. And if not, do it with someone else, such as one of the advocates with Baobab Women's Project. Now, at that screening interview, or at the end of it, they may also give you a document that's known as a preliminary information questionnaire, which you are told to complete and return it to the Home Office by a date that they will give you. You may not be given it, don't worry if you don't. Again, if you don't have legal advice to be able to complete it, you may not be able to do it within, say, the 60 days that they've told you must send it in. What's important sometimes is to keep communicating with the Home Office so they don't think you're just ignoring everything you've been told. So if you've been given a questionnaire and you can't complete it because you haven't had the legal advice, try and send something to them by the date that they've set in the questionnaire to say, I can't do this because I don't have any legal advice. Now, just to say about that questionnaire, which we abbreviate as PIQ, it asks for information you've already been asked for in the screening interview. And therefore, you don't need to repeat it in the PIQ. You do not have to complete every section of that PIQ. If it's asking you again about journey, if it's asking you again about family, if it's asking you again about education, just refer them back, say, I've already said that in my screening interview. Fill it all in if you wish to, but sometimes there's no need. Let's start with screening interviews. These are the very first interviews, often conducted on the same day that your claim is registered. So after registration of an asylum claim, and registration involves fingerprints and photographs, a screening interview takes place, often on the same day, but not always as the same day as registration. It depends what time you've attended the Home Office or what time you've been located. And as I've said already, it's headed Initial Contact and Asylum Registration Questionnaire. And it contains questions which are typed on the questionnaire itself. In other words, they're fixed questions. The officer who's doing the interview might ask you for extra questions. But in these screening interviews, those questions are typed so that they collect almost the same type of information from everyone who's first having their first interview with the Home Office. It's not like the main asylum interview, where the questions aren't fixed. We'll come back to that later. And the following statement is read at the beginning of the interview, either by the officer, or if you've got an interpreter, by the interpreter. And by the way, the interpreter may not be physically present. They may be on the phone, for example. So the statement that read is this. The officer is going to ask you some questions about your identity, family, background, travel history, and some health and welfare questions. The officer will only ask you for a brief outline of why you're claiming asylum today. Now, this interview is short and would often only take about 30 minutes. They can take longer sometimes. They may even be shorter. Now, what does the Home Office do with that interview? Well, firstly, they take information about how and when you arrived in the UK. They want to know about what we call your immigration history and about your journey, your method of travelling to the United Kingdom, because they monitor these things. Secondly, they use it to help decide if your claim will be considered in the UK. And then thirdly, they'll compare information in it to what you say in any other interview or which is available to the Home Office in other documents, such as a visa application form or a preliminary information questionnaire. Now, I'm going to go through the various parts of that screening interview because, as I've said, excuse me, the information is typed into the form itself, so we're able to see what questions they're going to ask. So the personal details are questions about name, date of birth, nationality, including whether you've got any evidence of what your nationality is, what language or languages you speak, what religion you are if you have any, what occupation you have, if you've had any work in the past, any contact details, so that's phone number, email address if you have them, address if you happen to have one already, family members who are with you in the United Kingdom, so they might be dependents on your claim, and then other close family members who are in the UK or indeed in any other country. Now, the purpose of these questions is both to identify you and also any other family members who might get permission to stay if they're with you, or get permission to enter to join you in the UK if you're granted asylum. So it's important that you set those out. It might be your partner, it might be your children, but it might also be other family members that were living with you. Might be your younger sister, for example, or younger brother, a niece, a nephew. They were part of your family. So it's important to mention them because it might be that you want them as well to join you in the future should you get permission to stay. Now, nationality is particularly important as it's the starting point for considering your claim. Depending upon your nationality, it is sometimes easier or far harder to get the Home Office to accept that you're from a country where there is a risk of what we call persecution or serious harm. And if you don't have proof of nationality, you'll see later on that in the main asylum interview, there might be particular type of questions that they ask you to try and identify whether they accept that you are indeed from the country that you're claiming you're from. So part 2, it's headed Health and Special Needs. Now this section asks for any information about your own physical or mental health, including any medication you might be already taking, and that of any family members living with you. Now it's not clear why these questions are asked, but nevertheless it's important to say if you're not well or if, for example, you have a disability. Don't feel shy about saying anything that's wrong, because it's important they understand the situation that you're in. You're in a stressful situation with this interview being conducted anyway. And it may well be that you know you suffer from depression. Maybe you haven't had chance yet to see a doctor or get some medication for it. But don't pretend that everything's okay if you're really struggling. Now, that same section also asks about exploitation and gives examples of sexual exploitation or being forced to work or commit a crime. Now, if this has happened to you, this may have been in your own country, in another country before you arrived here, or on your journey to the UK, or even in the UK itself, or it might be a combination of those. Now, whether or not your asylum claim is about exploitation, which we sometimes call trafficking or modern slavery, it's important to mention the way that you've been treated by other people, including those who've been involved in your journey, the agents I'm thinking of in particular, but people that you travelled with maybe, as it may have an impact on your ability or willingness to talk about other things that are part of your claim. So even if it's not directly relevant as to why you think it's not safe to go back, if that has had an impact on you, then mention it. If it's affected your health, and when you come to the section on the journey, again, say something then. I often find that it's the journey that has caused more trauma for people than what they might have experienced already or what they fear might return. And it's not that that's still happening, but it's had an effect upon them. And it's important for the Home Office to know that. Now, if you have experienced any exploitation at any point, the Home Office should ask you if you would agree for your case to be referred to a special unit which deals with what's called modern slavery or trafficking. This is through a process called the National Referral Mechanism. Now, if you're 18 or over, it's your choice as to whether or not you would agree for the Home Office to make that referral. But generally speaking, it's a good idea. It's a separate section. I don't go into that anywhere else in these particular slides. Now, this section also asks about what level of education you've had. It's not particularly relevant. It doesn't matter if you've never had any education or if you've, for example, got a degree. It's not clear why they're asking it. You'll find the questionnaire, the preliminary information questionnaire, asks similar things. Answer it if you wish, but if you don't wish to answer it, just leave it. Or you can, but as it's in an interview, just give the best answer that you can. Now, part 3 is about travel and what we call third country. By third country, I mean, if you haven't come directly from your country to the United Kingdom, then you've been in another country. That's the third country, and it may have been more than one. So the first question in part 3 is, why have you come to the UK? In other words, why have you specifically come to the UK? Why have you ended up here? Now, remember, the Home Office will use fingerprints and other information such as visa applications to get what we call your immigration history. And they will compare what you say in this section of the interview to the information they get from elsewhere. If, for example, and this won't necessarily come up in this interview, but if, for example, they say, have you ever applied for a visa to another country, and you don't tell them that you have, and they later find out that you applied, possibly using a different identity, but a visa to the USA, then they will hold it against you that you didn't give that information at this stage. Now that preliminary question is followed by questions about being fingerprinted in any country, the route that you took to come to the UK, what transport you used, how long you stayed in other countries, if you know where you were, and if you didn't come directly, whether you claimed asylum in any other country, and what you said on arrival in the UK. Now, again, the answers you give will be used to check that you're telling the truth. For example, by comparing what you say to other documents that they have. But it also may be used against you, for example, if you pass through other countries that they think are what they call safe. And that's particularly countries in the European Union. And there's a separate information about how to deal with this in the next slide and in a separate session on the preliminary information questionnaire. So let's look at this point about traveling through other countries. If you traveled through other countries, particularly through European countries such as Italy and France, others as well, it's important to say why you didn't stay there, or if you did stay there or even claimed asylum there, what happened? What happened to the asylum claim? Why didn't you stay? For example, it might be because people you knew were leaving for another country and you wanted to stay with them, or you were not treated well in the country that you were in, or it wasn't safe. You could see from others that even those who've got refugee status there, for example, in Italy, are not being treated well and are living on the streets. And so you didn't think it was a place that you could stay. Or it might be that you had no idea what asylum was. You may not even have known that for a while until after you'd arrived in the UK, and you didn't know that you could claim it. But there are various reasons that you need to give about why you carried on your journey. Now, whatever the reason is for continuing your journey to the UK, if you even knew that this is where you were traveling on to eventually, some people don't know that you're coming to the UK. Try to help the interviewing officer understand that this was not necessarily a journey that was planned from the beginning, but it's one that happened for different reasons along the way. You got to one country, you then made a decision, or someone else made a decision to move you to another, or you didn't have the money to be able to carry on, or there was a reason why you were actually coming to the UK. Community, family, language, or to get away as far as possible from the things that had made you leave your country in the first place. Now, if you were under the control of someone else at any part of the journey, someone who was telling you what you could or could not do, it's important that you explain that. Now, I'm conscious that although we're talking about this screening interview, many of you may well have had this screening interview before you've even seen these slides. So if that's the case, go back and think about some of the things I'm saying and whether you can give additional information, either at your main asylum interview when they ask you about your screening interview and whether it's correct, whether you've understood it, but also you might be able to submit some information in advance. So don't think it's too late for you to do something about this. Part 4, in theory at least, it's just an introduction for you to be talking about why it is you've claimed asylum. And it starts with a statement that should be read to you. And it says, please briefly, and they are the ones who emphasize that, briefly explain all of the reasons why you cannot return to your home country. Now, on the one hand, they're telling you to be brief. They don't want much information because there's a big asylum interview coming up at some point. But at the same time, they're using the word all, as though you've just got to at least give one sentence or two about the reasons you cannot go home. Now, try to say as much as you feel you can in answer to this question, because if you don't mention something important here, but you say it later, for example, at your main asylum interview, they may say that it isn't true. They would have said, if you really were arrested at that time, you would have said it in your first interview. So you're just adding it on to give some more sense that there's a risk and that doesn't really exist. So, for example, if you were detained, if you were abused by family, if you were sexually assaulted at any time, please say this, but you can add that you don't want to go into any details at the moment. It's hard. especially in the formal environment of an interview such as this, to say things that are happened in your past that you don't really want to think about, let alone talk about. But if you can at least indicate to them that something bad has happened and what that is, without giving any details, then at least put that on the record if you can. Now, one of the optional questions in this section is, when did this happen? Now, don't guess at a date when you don't know it. And if nothing has happened yet, say why you think it may happen if you go back. So you might have got away before something bad happened. And you want them to know that even though it hasn't yet happened yet, it might be that it will happen in the future. Now, this section asks you if you would be more comfortable at any future interview to be interviewed by a man or a woman, and whether you prefer the interpreter to be male or female. If there are things that you wouldn't say, for example, in front of a man, including a male interpreter, then be honest and say you want a woman interviewer and interpreter. Now, saying that at this interview doesn't guarantee that that's what you will get. But if you're fairly sure you cannot at a later interview talk openly, for example, in front of any man, about what has happened to you, then when you go for that interview and you find they've got a male officer or a male interpreter, you can say again, I can't do this. We'll come back to that later. Now, part 5 is headed Criminality and Security. Now, this is what we call a kind of a national security section. They're trying to decide whether or not anything you might have done means that you can't get refugee status, either because of criminal activity before you arrived, or because you've done something which might threaten the security of this country. So it asks a series of questions which are intended to help the Home Office decide if they should not give you refugee status because of what you've done in the past. For example, the questions include, have you ever, in any country, been accused of or have committed an offence for which you've been or could have been convicted? Another one is, have you ever been involved with or accused of being involved with any armed or violent organisation, group or party? Now, obviously, the answer presumably to most of these questions will be no, but they might also ask you if you've ever worked for a government department. And if you have, even if it doesn't cause any problems for the United Kingdom, then just mention that briefly. It may not be particularly relevant for this section, but it's worth just putting that information in at that stage. Now, part 6, it's a section they may not even ask you. It's for the officer to take information, if it's needed, to decide whether or not they should detain you rather than giving you bail. And the majority of people are given bail. They're told they must live at a specific place or they must report at a certain time, things like that. So this section is optional. You may not be asked. But the introduction says, in general, there's a presumption not to detain. They will not detain most people. If they do go on to complete it, it continues with things that should be considered, such as what's the likelihood of the person being removed? In other words, have you given them a valid passport that's still valid, so they don't have to get anything from your country to send you back? So they might consider that. Is there a history of absconding? Have you been what we might call underground? Have you not been in touch with them for a long time? So they want to keep in contact with you now. And what are the person's ties with the UK? Clearly, if you have any other family members here, they would ordinarily expect you just to go home and to go back, not say go home, go back to where they are, wherever it is that you're staying with them, rather than detaining you. If the interviewing officer decides to complete this section, the question is the following. Can you tell me if there are any particular reasons why you should not be detained while your claim is considered? And it gives examples such as personal circumstances, health, or any special needs. Let's just go on then to part 7. It's coming towards the end of the screening interview, and it's asking here, so the first part of this section that's headed declaration says, have you understood all the questions? Now, the truth is that you won't really know if you've understood all the questions until you see the notes of the interview later on. So it's fine to say something like, I think so. Apologies, I've just gone on too quickly. We come back to the declaration. They go on to ask, is there anything else you'd like to add or change to your response? But regardless of what you've said, possibly through an interpreter, you don't know what's been interpreted. You do not know what has been typed up or written down. So an answer that you could give could be, I don't think so, because you don't know. So you're not saying there's nothing I want to add or change because you don't know yet if there's something missing, something that you said that wasn't recorded. You don't know. So if you just say, I don't think so, you could always add if you wanted to, but once I've read it, there might be something I want to add or change. And before you sign, the following statement should be read to you. By signing this application, you're declaring that all of your personal details are correct, that you understand it's a criminal offence to seek to obtain leave to remain in the UK by deception. Your signature below also confirms that you've understood all of the questions asked and received a copy of this interview. Now, you may not be given the interview at the time. It might be given to you later. If you have a legal representative, a solicitor, or another advisor, it may be given to them. And as I've said above in this slide, you don't know if you've understood all the questions until you've had time to look at them later. You don't know if what's been recorded is everything that you said and if it's been recorded accurately. And that's why it's important that you go through that interview with someone's help if needed, so that you can make a note and correct anything that's wrong, preferably in advance of any main asylum interview, but certainly during and towards the start of the main asylum interview itself. So let's look at the main asylum interviews. Now, asylum interviews, what I've called earlier on the main asylum interview, follows the registration of a claim. It follows fingerprinting, photographs, screening interview, and the Home Office also obtaining reports, possibly visa applications if you made an application before you came, the preliminary information questionnaire if one was submitted, and any other information and documents, including a review of what they know about or think they know about your country. And I've got a quote here from guidance that's issued to caseworkers on conducting asylum interviews. And you'll find several quotes in the slides that follow. The first one is this: to prepare for the interview, you must read the claimant's reasons for making the asylum claim in the screening form or screening interview, preliminary information questionnaire, witness statement if something's been submitted, or any other relevant information in the case file, such as information about the claimant's visa application records, relevant country reports or country guidance, including case law. Case law is decisions that are made by the courts in the United Kingdom. Now, if you have other family members in the UK with you, maybe you have a partner, and they've been interviewed as well when your claim was registered, that's also information that's taken into account before the main asylum interview. Now, that's unusual, but it may have happened in a few cases. Now, I've already said that what you say in an asylum interview will be compared to what you've said or submitted before, or other information the Home Office has about you or about your country. You might not have been the one who completed the visa application form, but nevertheless, they'll have that visa application form, and they may ask you questions about it or expect you to know what's in it. Now, try, if you possibly can, to get some legal advice before you attend your main asylum interview, whatever your claim is about. And I know for a lot of asylum seekers now, there is no free legal advice available through what we call legal aid solicitors. But if you could try to get some advice, somebody can review your claim a little bit of what's happened so far, give you an idea of what might happen during your asylum interview, but these slides are intended to at least be some form of advice for you. Now, just deal with some practicalities first. Now, the letter that invites you to an interview will specify the time and place that the interview will take place. Now, you'll need to take that letter with you to the appointment, together with your Home Office identity document, which is an application registration card. Now, even if the interview is going to be by video, you'll still be required to attend at a Home Office building. We come back to video interviews later on. Now, interviews rarely start on time, so be prepared for a wait. Aim to get there half an hour before they say the interview is due to start, but be prepared for a wait until later on. They only allow a certain amount of time for these interviews because they've scheduled several interviews through the day. They only got your room, for example, for 2 hours, so they shouldn't be too late starting, but nevertheless, it might be some delay. Now, some of these interviews take place in buildings where other people are there to report, and it may be busy. You may, in fact, see officers in uniform there. That's not the people who'll be dealing with you. The person who interviews you, even if you see them by video, will be in ordinary clothes, not in uniform. These Border Force officers are there for a different purpose. If your interview is with an officer physically present with you in the room rather than on video, you will sit in a room with that person. They'll be on the other side of the desk. They'll be seated behind a computer screen. You'll be able to see them, but nevertheless, you can't necessarily see them fully completely. You can't see what, for example, they're typing. And if there is a Home Office interpreter, they'll be seated next to the officer opposite you. Now, according to recent statements from the Home Office, the interview should now only take 45 minutes instead of several hours, but be prepared for the fact that it may well take much longer than that. Even going through the preliminary statements at the beginning can take some time, and I'm going to take you through some of those. Now, if you have children with you in the UK, try to make arrangements for someone to look after them, or if it's during school time, for someone else to meet them from school, rather than you having to be concerned so much about them. You need, if possible, to be able to focus on this interview. Now, whether or not the interview is by video, take evidence with you of any medication you're receiving. Might be just the box of tablets so you can show what it is, even on the video. Any other documents that help to show that what you're saying about your identity, your nationality, what's happened to you is true. Although those can be submitted afterwards within a week of the interview. Now, if your interview is by video, you're thinking, well, how can I show them this? Sometimes what the person doing the interview does is to contact someone who's physically in the building where you're sitting to ask them to come and take those documents from you so they can photocopy them, and then they'll give you the originals back. That may be what happens. Now, if the interview can't be completed that day, or the officer decides they need to ask more questions, you may be invited back for a second and sometimes a third asylum interview. They don't get it all done on one day. Sometimes the officers go back and they show what they've asked and the questions you've given to a senior officer, and the senior officer will say to them, go back and ask them this. Or occasionally, instead of doing another interview, they'll actually send a letter or an email through saying, can you please answer these questions? And again, before you answer them, try and get some legal advice. And this is taken from the Home Office guidance to their own caseworker. So what they say is the purpose of that main asylum interview. They say this: the policy objective when you conduct an asylum interview is to gather enough evidence to be able to properly consider and determine the claim. You must provide a positive and secure environment to support the claimant, that's you, to disclose all evidence, including sensitive information to support their claim. You must ensure that all asylum claimants are treated with respect, dignity, and fairness, regardless of their age, disability, ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or belief. You must ask appropriate and focused questions to encourage full disclosure and gather relevant evidence on important aspects of the claim. This will allow you to assess the credibility of the claimant's statements, give the claimant an opportunity to explain anything that appears to be implausible or inconsistent, and make potentially vulnerable claimants aware of appropriate support services. For example, where there are concerns over physical and mental health, the claimant has experienced torture, sexual or domestic violence, or modern slavery, or there are child protection concerns. And that's the guidance that they're given. Treat you with respect, provide a positive and secure environment. That isn't how you're necessarily going to experience, because it's a formal situation in a room where you can actually hear slightly things that are going on outside. It's not a welcoming place, but nevertheless, they should do the best they can, even within that situation, to make sure that you feel as comfortable as you can to be able to talk about things that are difficult and that you might not want to refer to. This is again from their guidance. If a witness statement, preliminary information questionnaire, or other written evidence has been submitted before the interview, you must establish who wrote and submitted the evidence. You must ask the claimant if they've read and understood the content of the evidence and if they agree with it. If the claimant indicates they have not had the written evidence read back to them in full in a language they understand, even if they've signed it, the interview should be suspended and the situation clarified with a legal representative. You should note any response or explanation provided by the legal representative on the interview record. Now, you may not have a lawyer, but if something has been submitted on your behalf, as it says here, a statement or a questionnaire, or something else has been sent in, make sure you know what it is that's been sent and whether or not it's correct. Because if it isn't correct, you need to be able to, or if you just don't know what it is, then you just have to say that at this point. What we don't want is something going on record that you haven't had any control over and you can't say is true. Now, this is the guidance they're given about interviews by video, and you'll find when it comes to the last paragraph on this page that actually video interviews are not appropriate for many of the asylum claims. But this, let's start at the beginning. Most asylum interviews are now conducted by video, meaning that the interviewing officer and the interpreter, if there is one, can only be seen on a screen. This may make it harder to talk about things that have happened. Some people might find that easier, but others, it's often harder. You don't engage with people in the same way if you can't see them properly. Now, there is an option to ask for a face-to-face interview. The letter that you get doesn't tell you whether it's going to be face-to-face or video. It tells you it might be by video. But if you think you really know you can't deal with something by video, the request for it to be face-to-face should ideally be made before the day of the interview, but it can be made on the day itself. Now, the guidance to their own caseworkers says, if the claimant or their legal representative, so you don't have to have a legal representative, could be you yourself saying this, if the claimant or their legal representative considers that remote interviewing, meaning interview by video, you're not physically present in the same place, would not be suitable for them, they must contact the number provided in the invitation to interview letter and provide reasons why it's not suitable in their case. I'm not aware of telephone numbers actually being given, but it might be that you've got an email address that you can use to communicate with and say, please don't do this. I can't do my interview in this way. And they say in their own guidance, there are cases where interview by video is not a good idea. And this covers a lot of cases. Cases involving sexual orientation or gender identity. Victims of torture or other trauma where recording was part of the persecution. Victims of sexual violence or other forms of gender-based persecution. Victims of modern slavery or claimants with mental health conditions. Now, that's their own guidance. So if you think you fall into one of those categories, then try and say in advance, according to your guidance, you shouldn't be interviewing me in this way. Please arrange for a face-to-face interview. Now, there are opening questions or comments on this typed interview, I said earlier on that the questions themselves are not typed for this main asylum interview. The person conducting the interview will know what they want to ask you, but you don't know until you're there and sitting there and the questions are being put. It's not like the screening interview, but there are statements or comments that are made at the beginning, and these are some of them. If you do not understand a question, please tell me, and I will clarify or rephrase it. This interview is your opportunity to tell us your reasons for claiming asylum. If you want to take a break during the interview, please let me know. I may also suggest a break if I think that we need to take one. I read your statements of evidence and documents. There's no need to repeat this information today unless I ask you questions about them. You will have the opportunity to add to, amend, or explain the information you have provided. So those are statements that are read to you. There's then a number of preliminary questions. Do you understand the interpreter? Now, you may well say yes to that, but you haven't really started the detail of the interview. So even if you said yes in answer to that question, if later on you find you're not understanding the interpreter, or the interpreter is not understanding you, or maybe the interpreter is not really understanding the officer and their questions, then you can say, I think there's a problem. I've said this already, and I'll say it again. Another question is, are you feeling well enough to be interviewed today? Now, if you've waited a long time for this important interview, you probably don't want to say, I don't feel well enough. But you have to think about the consequences of going ahead and possibly rushing to get to the end of the interview and missing something important or getting something wrong because you're not actually really well enough to do it on this day. And you might have to say, I don't feel too well. Now, they'll ask you what that means. They'll ask you why you don't feel well, and they may well suggest they start the interview. Or it might be at the beginning, you say, yeah, I'm fine. Yes. Are you feeling well enough to be interviewed? Yes. And they carry on. But later on, some health problem occurs, either because of what they're asking you or because for some other reason. You can later on say, I'm not feeling too well. You can come back to that later on. Another question is, do you have any documents or other evidence you wish to submit today? I've suggested you take relevant documents with you. You may need advice about what they might be. You will need to explain how they're relevant to your claim. They should ask you questions about those documents. Are you aware of and happy with the contents of your screening interview, your visas, and any other information you may have submitted to the Home Office and any other UK authorities? That's why you need to know what was in the visa application form. If you haven't got a copy, you can ask in advance for a copy of the visa application form. If they don't give it to you, or you're not aware and you've gone for your interview and you didn't know you could ask for it, you can say, I haven't seen the visa application form, or I haven't seen the screening interview, or I've read the screening interview and these things are wrong, or I said this at the screening interview and it wasn't recorded. Can you please make a note of this now? That's why it's important to read things through. Now, there's a statement that's read to the interpreter by the officer, which the interpreter, although it's said to them, they should actually read it out loud to you so that they understand what they're being told. And it's this: you must interpret everything that is said during the interview in direct speech. Please do not change what I say or what the claimant says. You must tell me if you have any difficulty in understanding or interpreting my questions or any of the replies. If the claimant starts to speak in another language or dialect during the interview, you must tell me immediately. Now, in my experience, it's Home Office interpreters rather than interviewing officers who can present the greatest challenge in an interview. Some of them don't take kindly to any suggestion. They're either not being understood, or they're not properly interpreting the question or answer, or they've not themselves understood what's being said to them by the officer. Now, remember what was said to you at the beginning of the interview. This interview is your interpreter to tell us your reasons for claiming asylum. Don't let the interpreter or the officer take that opportunity away from you. Don't think I have to agree with everything that's being done. If you've got a problem with the interpreter, please try and put that on record. Because if it ends up that something is not recorded properly or you've misunderstood a question and you don't know about it and you think you've done it correctly, later on it appears, you say, hold on a minute, that's not what happened. It's important that's recorded in the interview, that there are difficulties with the interpreter. Now, these are general advice on answering questions. These actually apply to appeals as well, but we're just concentrating on interviews at the moment. Make sure that you've understood the question properly. And if you're not sure what the question is about, ask for it to be repeated or rephrased. And don't start to answer a question before you are clear about what you're being asked about. Never guess about what you think the answer is. Don't feel that you've got to answer every question with something really substantial, significant. If you don't know the answer, then say, I don't know, or I can't remember. When you've understood the question, answer it as directly as you can. If you think you've made a mistake or that you've not been asked about something you think is important, then say that in answer to the question at the end, which says, is there anything that you would like to add or amend? Now, at that point of the interview, you'll be saying, I just want to go home. You won't say that, but that's what you'd be thinking. I want to go back to my family. I want to go back to friends. I just want to get out of here. That's what you'd be thinking. But if you think there's something important that you want to emphasize that maybe you've already said, or something that you haven't actually said before and you want to add, because they haven't asked you something you think is relevant, just make a comment about that at the end, even if it's only brief. You can always come back to that after the interview in order to add some more information. We're going to look at possible questions that you might be asked during a main asylum interview. Now, the questions asked are specific to each individual case, and it's not possible to know what questions you will be asked. But the slides that follow cover some of the more likely things that may come up, and some of them will apply to you, hopefully. Now, depending upon where you're from, the journey that you've had to the UK, or why you've claimed asylum, there are some ideas that can be given to help you prepare for the interview. Now, I've said this next bit already, but it's always worth repeating. In advance of any interview, you should read through or have someone read to you your screening interview and any statement that has been submitted. If you've submitted a completed preliminary information questionnaire, you should know what has been written in it. And again, if there's anything wrong in either of those, when asked at the beginning, have you read those? Have you understood them? Are they correct? You may need to say no and point out what is wrong. So if a solicitor or advisor has submitted anything on your behalf, make sure you've got a copy of it. You know what has been written or said on your behalf. And if any of it isn't correct, you must make that clear at the beginning of the interview when they ask you about those documents. Let's look at, first of all, if you don't have any proof, particularly of your nationality, but also possibly of your identity, which might include your age. So if you don't have any document to confirm who you are, where you're from, how old you are, they may ask you questions to see what you know about your country. These questions can be about the history. It can also be about the geography, be about rivers, mountains, famous landmarks of the country, or at least the part that you lived in. Might ask you a bit about the government. Might ask you about the type of money in your country. You know, what is printed on the banknotes? Is it a picture of someone? How much? How many different banknotes can you have? What type of coins there are? Are there any particular festivals that are celebrated? They might ask you about food. They might ask you to describe flags. So there are many reasons why you may not know the answer to these questions. Don't, as I've said already, don't guess whatever the question is. Do not guess at what you think the answer should be. Try and explain why you don't know. Might be no education, or it might be that you only lived there as a child. The next questions, well, not necessarily in any particular order, they may ask you questions at some point about your delay in claiming asylum. You may be asked why you claimed asylum when you'd already been in the UK, for example, as a visitor, as a student, or you'd overstayed. You'd had some permission to be here and you stayed longer than you should. Or you might have been here in a different capacity. You might have come as somebody's wife or partner. Think about how it is that you even found out about asylum, even the meaning of it, and that this might be something that applied to you. You might have thought the only way to get to stay here safely was to apply as a student or apply in some other capacity. And then suddenly you realized, actually, there's this thing called asylum and that applies to me. So what did you learn from people that you met? Was it somebody you met in the mosque or the church? Was it someone in the area you were living in? What did they tell you? Did you even get some advice or information in advance that you didn't really know what it meant? Did you get any legal advice? If so, who was it from? When did you get it? What did they say? Were there any particular reasons why you did not claim asylum before the date that you did? Is it partly that you didn't know that it was something you could do, or you were thinking maybe you could go back? So were there other reasons that you didn't claim asylum before? Were you, for example, still hoping to go back, thinking that things might settle down? Now, everyone's story is different, so think about how it is that you claimed asylum when you did. There's a question, this is a claim based upon religion, and I'm looking in particular at conversion to Christianity. And in the guidance to caseworkers, it says, in the case of conversion to Christianity, you should expect the clemency experience normally to include being baptized using water. Now, if you know anything about baptism, it's different in different Christian traditions. What a Catholic church might do might be different to all the many different denominations you get within Protestantism. But nevertheless, they expect this baptism using water. Don't worry if that hasn't happened to you. Don't get something done because you think I've got to tick this box. The guidance goes on in interview. You should expect the claimant to be able to describe the encounters or contacts with their new religion or belief. I don't quite know what they mean by that. But they go on and say this may include the people whose words or example inspired them, the recordings which struck a chord and which contributed to the decision to accept and follow it. You should also expect them to be able to describe how far this occurred in the home country or in the UK. You should ask the claimant to describe their church experiences, for example, whether this has been within small house groups or in a congregational worship, including the languages in use at these groups or services. This will help frame questions about their experiences of the Bible and church services. Now, there are so many variations in churches, it's impossible to know how they expect their own officers to actually know so much about all of these things to ask appropriate questions, but nevertheless, they will try and do so. But I've added this point at the bottom. It's possible that you may not have changed your religion, but you were interested in exploring what other religions said. And for example, people in your family or community threatened or ill-treated you as a result, or they would do so if you were sent back. So they might have thought you were going to convert to another religion, and maybe you did, or maybe you might in the future. But it's not that you've been baptized. It's not that you know a lot about, for example, the Bible, but you were exploring it. Now try to explain that you've not converted, but might do so in the future, and why any other religion interested you, because sometimes they'll just assume it's a complete, what we call conversion experience. And it might be that you're just on the path to learning something else. At some point, you might say, no, I don't want to change. but the problem's already occurred because your family think you have done this. I know people where their Hindu family believe they've converted to Islam. They haven't, because they're not following Hinduism in a way that their family does back in India. They think there's been a conversion. That we have to help the Home Office understand people's experiences of all these things are different. What about a claim that's based on religion? It might not be a conversion or reversion back to Islam. It might be rejection of a religion, or it might be actions considered to be against religious teachings. For example, a woman not wearing a hijab. Alternatively, someone may be persecuted simply for their religion. There are Muslim countries that persecute Muslims because they are following Islam in a particular way that they think is raising objections to the way the country is run, even though it's a Muslim country. What the guidance says is simply claiming to hold a set of beliefs which result in persecution is not enough to substantiate a claim to refugee status. You must ask questions to enable the decision maker to decide whether the claimant genuinely adheres to the religion or belief to which they profess to belong, how that individual observes those beliefs in the private and public spheres, and whether that would place them at risk of persecution on return to their country. What about a claim based upon persecution as a woman? And I draw a distinction here between this and domestic abuse, which comes next. Now, being a woman in some countries is enough to make you a second-class citizen and liable to persecution or serious harm because what you have done or failed to do. But being a woman, just for that status alone, it's not enough by itself. Reasons in addition to that that might put you at risk are because you've rejected an arranged marriage, or you were forced to marry and then treated like a slave by your husband or his family, or you might have had children outside of marriage. There's something else that's added on which they could accuse you of in addition to you being a woman who perhaps doesn't have the same rights as you might have in other countries. And the questions you will be asked will be to get more information from you about why you say it's not safe for you as a woman. And let's come on to the slide about domestic abuse. Now, domestic abuse can take place within a family, including from a father, not simply a husband, or within marriage. And either, even if there's a marriage, either at the hands of the woman's husband or members of his family, not necessarily from him. Now, the first thing that's important is the Home Office needs to accept that the abuse happened. In addition to that you will be alone and unsupported in your country if you're back there, or even if there are people like your mother or maybe an aunt that still want to stick with you. They don't have the ability to step aside from their own husband or family in order to be able to give you that support. So there's no realistic option. They're going to be there for you, even if they want to be. Now, if you've worked in your country and possibly lived away from the person or people abusing you, they may ask you why you couldn't live somewhere else in the country and be able to carry on working to support yourself. Now, questions at an interview will be about what happened and when, but also, and probably will, include the following. Whether you sought help from the authorities. For example, did you go to the police or did you go to any organisation supporting women? If you didn't seek help, why didn't you do so? If you did seek help, what happened? What about claims based upon political activity? This might be your political activity, by the way, or it might be the political activity of someone within your family that has repercussions for you. It might be your husband, it might be your father. You might not be politically active yourself, though this slide assumes this might apply to you. But if you're being blamed for something that someone else has done or someone else's belief, and they're coming for you as well, you might have to try and explain that. But if you yourself have taken part in political activities, either in your country or in the UK, you will be asked questions about what those activities have been. Are they demonstrations? Were you distributing leaflets? When did you do it? Where did you do it? How often? How did you become involved? What happened? If you have distributed leaflets, you may be asked for information about what was in those leaflets. If you don't know for some reason, try and explain why you don't know. For example, you've never learned to read, you don't know the content, and you were able to trust the person who was giving you the leaflets so that you were confident you were doing something that was helping the political cause. If you have been involved with a political party or organization in your country, you may be asked questions about that party or organization, which might include its history, the leadership, elections, and things like that. Now, remember again, do not guess what the answer is. Be prepared to say why you don't know the answer. For example, you were not at a high level. That information wasn't given to you. And in the guidance they give to caseworkers, it gives this example. An illiterate farm worker, someone who doesn't read or write, occupation has been farming, may not necessarily be able to provide details of national political developments, despite being a grassroots supporter of the political opposition. So they should take into account what was the level of your involvement, how long were you involved, who did you know who was involved. You don't have to go and read up on the history of the organisation. If you know it, share it. But otherwise, this is not a test to see what you can learn, as if you're doing an exam. Claims based upon trafficking or modern slavery. Now, trafficking can take various forms. Sexual exploitation is one. This can include being brought to the UK on the understanding you were going to study here, or you thought there was something else going to happen, and you were tricked. It could be forced labour outside of the home, including in hotels, catering and cleaning. It could be forced labour inside the home, domestic labour, might be childcare and housekeeping. It could be forced criminal activity, including begging and growing or distributing drugs. Now, questions at an interview may include where this happened, how you were treated and by who, whether you had any opportunity to leave. For example, if you were allowed free time when you could go out. And if they think you have been able to go out unsupervised without somebody checking on you, they might begin to say, well, why is it you didn't leave at that point? Why did you go back? So you sometimes need to try and explain what the control was, how it was. You didn't know anybody, you didn't know where you could go, they'd retained your passport. Just have a think about those things. If there's been a separate decision on your claim to have been trafficked because it's dealt with by a different section, and it's been decided that you were not trafficked, the Home Office will certainly take that into account in their decision. Having said that, if there's a decision that you were trafficked, it's what we call a conclusive grounds decision. It doesn't automatically mean that you're going to get asylum. Why? Asylum is about what might happen in the future. Trafficking is about what's happened in the past. And although what's happened in the past may be accepted, if there's no risk on return that it's going to occur again, that you're going to be ill-treated, persecuted, experienced some form of forced labour on your return, or trafficked again out of your country, they would say, that's fine, we're sorry for what's happened. They don't use that language, but it's not going to happen again, and therefore you don't need asylum. You just need to understand the link between these two. What about claims based upon sexual orientation or gender identity? And the guidance says this: where sexual orientation or gender identity is the basis of a claimant's claim, you should focus the interview on establishing the claimant's current sexual orientation or gender identity, how they define and express it, and how this is relevant to their fear or harm in their home country. Now, questions are often about how and when you were aware, for example, that you were attracted to other women, what relationships you had, if any, what happened that made it impossible for you to stay in your country. Again, like any claim, if you can get advice in advance about what, not just what they might ask, but the type of information that you should be giving them, then try to get that advice if you possibly can. Now, separate to questions that they might ask you specifically about yourself, If you have children with you in the UK, the Home Office should take into account what will happen to them as well as you if you're refused and told to return to your country, because they'll expect the children to go with you. Your children may face problems of their own. There might be girls at risk of FGM, female genital mutilation. Your children may have been threatened because of your political activity. They may face problems because you're not married to their father. If the Home Office doesn't ask questions about your children or your child, you can mention your concerns for your children when you're asked at the end of the interview if there's anything you want to add. And it might be that you've actually made your claim because of the children. You wanted to avoid your daughter or daughters being subjected to either FGM or the type of family abuse that you've experienced yourself. You don't want them to go through that. You're not so concerned about yourself, it's your children. So you need to make sure they understand the importance of your children to you and what it is you fear for them, even if it's you're the one who's claiming asylum. If your main asylum claim is about your children, then try and make that clear from the very beginning in everything that you say. I claimed asylum because, and you link it to what has happened or might happen to your children. There's other questions that you may well be asked. And the first one is asking for help in your country. I've mentioned it, for example, in relation to women who might fear or have experienced domestic abuse. So asylum is given if you're at risk of persecution or serious harm in your country. Yes, that's true. But it's also if you cannot get protection from the authorities there. Unless it's people in the authorities that are out to hurt you, you will need to explain why you cannot get help from someone in your country. So there are likely to be questions about whether you went to anyone official, for example, the police, to get help. And if you did, what they said or did. Now, most people know that there is little that, for example, the police will do, even if you did go to seek help from them. You know your country better than the Home Office. You know, if you went, the police would just turn it away and say it's nothing to do with us, it's domestic abuse, or you're not behaving properly anyway, so just go back and behave properly. You shouldn't be doing that type of thing. They're not interested. It's not their concern. If that is your experience, you need to try to find a way to help the Home Office understand the reality of the situation in their country. Yes, they'll have read reports about your country. It doesn't mean those reports are accurate. It doesn't mean they're up to date. Or it might be that there's just not enough information in those reports for them to really know what is it like for people in your country. Another thing that they will also consider, and questions may come up about, is they might consider whether or not you could, excuse me, instead of coming to the UK, whether you could have moved to another part of your country. And even if the Home Office believe that what you're saying, they believe it, they accept it all as true, they may still refuse you because they think there's another part of your country you could have gone to instead of leaving. So you may be asked a question like, were these problems just in part of the country where you lived? Or why couldn't you have gone to, or why can't you go to? And they'll name specific areas, usually bigger cities that are separate away. They'll do a bit of geography and they'll say, I can see that so-and-so is, Mumbai is nowhere near Nairobi, so you could have gone to a different city and they wouldn't know you were there. Now, if that type of question is asked, you need to explain why it was or it's not possible for you to live safely anywhere else. For example, your family will find out about you, or you cannot live by yourself. You've never worked, or you've never been independent. You cannot get work or you support yourself, and particularly if you've got children, how are you even going to support them? It might be that you need to register in a new place and you have no documents with you to prove who you are. So it's not reasonable for you to live anywhere else. It's going to be too bad, too harsh for you to do that. You need to try and explain that to them. Now, there might be problems that come up during the course of the interview. I know that when you get to this stage, you just want it to be done. But you also have to think about the problems that might occur if you go ahead, where there are problems that occur. So let's look at some of them. There are times when you may need to say that you do not wish to continue, and it isn't always easy to have the confidence to say this. So stopping the interview can be for some of the following reasons. Might be because of difficulties with the interpreter. If that happens, the interviewing officer should take time to understand the problem from your perspective, not just the interpreter. They should have a separate discussion with you, if they can, without having to use that interpreter to try and explain what you're saying. It might be because the interviewing officer has referred to documents which you haven't seen and you don't know what they're talking about. And you say, I don't know what they are. Can you show them to me? If they won't show them to you, it might be that you say, could you please make a note that I haven't seen them and I can't therefore comment on them. It might be because you're unwell, even if you were okay when you started the interview. But it might also be because the questions are upsetting you. You just don't feel you can go on. And maybe, even if you think I can go on, you're making your answers so short, you're missing out important information. Now, you may not want to stop because it might mean coming back again. But you have to weigh that option against the problems which might be caused, for example, by bad interpretation. You might not say as much as you should because you want the interview to end more quickly, and something important might then be missed. Can anyone go with me to the interview? Obviously, if you can have someone sitting there with you, even if they're not able to assist by prompting you or saying things for you, you might be a bit more confident. This is what the guidance says about someone, and I'm not here talking about a legal representative. I'm talking about other people. This is what the guidance says. For reasons of confidentiality, you will normally interview a claimant on their own or in the presence of a legal representative or regulated advisor. Exceptionally, however, and with advance notice, you may allow a friend or other companion of the claimant to be present to provide emotional or medical support. For example, if an interviewer of the requested gender has not been possible. Alternatively, a claimant may benefit from the presence of a supporter from their faith group or non-religious organization before or during the interview. And this can also be accommodated exceptionally and where advance notice is provided. A friend, companion, or supporter can be admitted on condition that they are there solely to provide emotional, medical, or spiritual support. They must not intervene during the interview unless it's to raise a welfare or safeguarding concern with the claimant using the Home Office interpreter. By that last phrase, they mean that the person with you must speak to the officer through the interpreter if there is one. They mustn't speak directly to you. They have to say it actually to the officer. The interpreter can then interpret. There are certain people who can't go with you. It can't be a member of your family. It can't be someone who themselves is seeking asylum. It can't be someone who might benefit from the positive outcome in your case. So it's got to be someone who's slightly independent from you. But think about that. That might be possible and beneficial to you in some circumstances. And then after the interview, this has changed a little. At the end, I've said here, at the end of the interview, you should be given a USB stick, which contains the typed interview record and the audio recording. That's often not the case anymore. I've forgotten to update this. They'll often get linked to the interview in some way. But whichever the method is, you need to be able to get a copy of that typed interview and preferably the audio recording as well. If you've got a legal representative, they will be told how to access it and you need it from them. But you also need to be able to sit down with them and go through that interview with them for them to give their advice and assistance about any response they might need to make to that interview. You may also be told there are some documents the Home Office expect you to submit and by what date you should send them. For example, about medical treatment you're receiving. They'll give you a date by which to send them. Try and do your best to do that. You should try to review the type record when you get it or listen to the recording to check that it's correct, preferably both, because what's in the audio recording might not be what's typed. You'll note today that when I've been talking to you, I'm not automatically just reading everything that's on the screen. I'm adding to it. I'm giving additional information. There might be information that you've said that's recorded in the audio recording, which is important, that isn't in the typed transcript. And you need to try and make sure it's added as quickly as possible to say, I also said this, and this is what's recorded in the interview, and pass that on. You need also, if there are any mistakes by you or someone else, the interpreter or the officer who conducted the interview, or something important has been missed, you need to get those corrected or that additional information to them as soon as possible, preferably within the week. And you also might need to send documents to the Home Office as soon as possible afterwards. That is all the information I have to share with you. Although I might seem as though I've been giving you advice, I feel I have, strictly speaking. The information in these slides is for training purposes, for you to go through preferably with your advocates at Baobab Women's Project, or maybe to listen to them yourselves, but then talk about that with someone. So strictly speaking, this is not legal advice, but hopefully information and guidance that helps you to deal with your asylum interviews. Thank you very much indeed for taking time to listen to this.